Close your eyes and let the ancient stories carry you through realms where gods walked among mortals and heroes shaped destiny. Before there was light, before there was darkness, before there was anything at all that we might recognize as existence, there was chaos. Not chaos in the way we use the word today, meaning disorder or confusion, but chaos as the ancient Greeks understood it, the primordial void, the yawning emptiness that preceded all creation, a vast and infinite nothingness that somehow contained within itself the potential for everything that would ever be. Imagine, if you can, absolute nothingness. Not the darkness of a moonless night, for darkness itself is something, a quality that can be perceived and named. Not the silence of a sealed room, for silence too is a state that implies the absence of sound, rather than the absence of everything. Chaos was beyond these concepts, a state so fundamental and so alien to our experience that the ancient Greeks could barely describe it except to say that it was the beginning, the source from which all else would flow. And yet, from this nothingness, something emerged. The first being to come into existence was Gaia, Mother Earth herself, the solid foundation upon which all life would eventually flourish. Gaia was not created by any conscious will or divine plan. She simply came to be, emerging from chaos through some process that the ancient myths leave mysterious and unexplained. Perhaps this is fitting, for how can we truly explain the emergence of something from nothing? It is a mystery that philosophy and science still grapple with today, and the ancient Greeks were wise enough to recognize that some mysteries are so profound that they can only be acknowledged, not explained. Gaia was vast and fertile, containing within herself all the raw material that would become mountains and valleys, forests and deserts, rivers and seas. She was conscious and alive, not in the way that a human or an animal is, alive, but possessed of a deeper, more fundamental awareness, the consciousness of the earth itself. She could feel, she could think, and, most important for what would follow, she could create. After Gaia came other primordial deities, beings so ancient and so fundamental that they were less like the gods we might imagine, and more like living embodiments of cosmic forces. There was Tartarus, the deep abyss far beneath the earth, a place of darkness and imprisonment that would later become the prison for those who defied the gods. There was Eros, not yet the chubby cherub of later art, but a primordial force of attraction and desire, the power that would draw beings together and make creation possible. There was Erebus, the personification of deep darkness, and his sister Nyx, the embodiment of night herself. Nyx was particularly powerful and ancient, so feared and respected that even Zeus, when he later became king of the gods, would be wary of offending her. She dwelt in a cave in Tartarus, and from her came a whole host of dark and necessary forces. Hypnos, who was sleep, Thanatos, who was death, the Moirai, or Fates, who determined the lifespan of every mortal, Nemesis, who was retribution, and many others. These were not evil forces, despite their association with darkness and death, but necessary aspects of existence, the shadows that give shape and meaning to the light. But let us return to Gaia, for it is with her that the true story of creation begins to unfold. Gaia, alone in the early cosmos, with only the other primordial forces for company, decided, or perhaps simply found herself compelled to create. From herself, without need of a partner, she brought forth Uranus, the sky, where Gaia was the earth, solid and nurturing. Uranus was the heavens above, vast and encompassing, stretching over Gaia like a great dome studded with stars. Uranus looked upon Gaia and desired her, and Gaia welcomed his embrace. The sky came down to meet the earth, and from their union came the first generation of divine beings who could truly be called gods. In a sense, we might recognize. These were the Titans, 12 in number, mighty beings who represented various aspects of the natural world and cosmic order. The Titans were Oceanus, the great river that the Greeks believed encircled the entire world; Coeus, associated with the axis of heaven; Crius, whose domain was the constellations; Hyperion, who represented light and who would father the sun, moon, and dawn; Iapetus, who would become the father of Prometheus and Atlas; Thea, who was divine light and the mother of celestial bodies; Rhea, who would become the mother of the Olympian gods; Themis, who embodied divine law and order; Mnemosyne, who was memory itself; Phoebe, associated with the moon and prophecy; Tethys, who was the mother of rivers and fresh water; and Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, who would become the most important for the story that follows. But Uranus and Gaia did not only produce the Titans, they also created the Cyclopes, 3 beings of enormous size and strength who each possessed a single eye in the center of their foreheads. Their names were Brontes, which means thunder; Steropes, which means lightning; and Arges, which means brightness. These 3 would later play a crucial role in the war between the Titans and the Olympians, for they were master craftsmen who would forge Zeus's mighty thunderbolts. And there were the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers named Codus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each of them had 50 heads and 100 arms, and their strength was so immense that they could hurl hundreds of boulders at once, making them devastating forces in battle. They too would prove crucial in the coming war for control of the cosmos. But Uranus, looking upon the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, was disturbed and perhaps even frightened by their monstrous appearance and terrible power, or perhaps he simply feared that they might eventually challenge his rule. Whatever his reasoning, Uranus made a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He seized the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires and hurled them down into Tartarus, that deep abyss beneath the earth, imprisoning them in darkness and ensuring they could never threaten him. Gaia was horrified and enraged by this treatment of her children. They were part of her, born from her body, and Uranus had cast them into eternal imprisonment without even consulting her. The pain of their imprisonment troubled her, for they were still within her, buried in the deepest parts of the earth, and she could feel their suffering. Moreover, she recognized the injustice and cruelty of what Uranus had done, so Gaia plotted revenge against her consort. From within herself, from the gray flint that was part of her substance, she fashioned a great sickle, a curved blade of adamant harder than any stone. Then she called her Titan children to her and explained what Uranus had done, how he had imprisoned their brothers out of fear and cruelty. She showed them the sickle she had created and asked which of them would be brave enough to use it against their father. The Titans were afraid. Uranus was immensely powerful, the sky itself made manifest, and to attack him seemed not just dangerous but almost blasphemous. Most of them refused or simply remained silent, unable to imagine taking action against their father. But Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, stepped forward. Whether he was driven by courage, by ambition, by genuine outrage at his father's actions, or by some combination of all 3, Cronus agreed to carry out his mother's plan. Gaia instructed Cronus on what he must do. She hid him near the place where Uranus would next come down to embrace her, and she gave him the great sickle. Then, when night fell and Uranus descended from the heavens to lie with Gaia, spreading himself over her as he had done countless times before, Cronus struck with one swift, terrible motion. Cronus swung the sickle and castrated his father, severing Uranus's genitals and casting them away. The blood that fell from this wound dripped onto Gaia, and from these drops would later be born the Erinyes, the Furies, those avenging spirits who punish crimes against the natural order, and the giants, who would one day wage war against the Olympian gods, and the Meliae, the nymphs of the ash trees. But the severed genitals themselves fell into the sea, and where they landed, the waters began to foam and churn. From this foam, nurtured by the generative power still contained in Uranus's severed flesh, arose Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. She emerged from the waves fully grown and stunningly beautiful, carried to shore by the wind and the waves, and wherever her feet first touched land, flowers sprang up from the earth. Uranus, grievously wounded and unmanned, withdrew to the upper heavens, and never again came down to embrace Gaia with the same all-encompassing closeness. The sky and earth were now separated, and the space between them became the realm where gods and eventually mortals would live. Before he departed, Uranus cursed Cronus, prophesying that he too would one day be overthrown by his own children, just as he had overthrown his father. This curse would hang over Cronus for all the years of his reign, shaping his actions and ultimately bringing about its own fulfillment. With Uranus defeated and withdrawn, Cronus became the ruler of the cosmos. He freed his Titan brothers and sisters from any constraints, and together they ushered in what would later be remembered as the Golden Age, a time of peace and prosperity when the world was young and perfect. But Cronus, remembering his father's curse and fearing his own overthrow, would soon take actions that would set in motion the next great turn of the cosmic wheel, the next chapter in the ongoing story of creation, destruction, and rebirth that defined the Greek understanding of existence itself. The age of Titans, under the rule of Cronus and the Titans, the cosmos entered what would later be remembered as the Golden Age, a time of perfect peace and harmony, when the world was still young and unspoiled. Cronus took as his consort his sister Rhea, and together they ruled over a realm that knew no war, no strife, no suffering of the kind that would later become common in the ages of gods and men. This was a time before mortals as we know them existed, but the earth was not empty or lifeless. The Titans themselves populated the world, along with various other divine and semi-divine beings who had emerged from Gaia or been born to the Titans. The world was fertile and generous, providing everything that was needed without labor or hardship. The climate was perpetually mild, neither too hot nor too cold, and the earth brought forth food in abundance without need for plowing or planting. Cronus was called the Crooked One, perhaps in reference to the curved sickle he had wielded against his father, or perhaps referring to the crooked, twisted nature of his thinking. For despite the peace and prosperity of his reign, Cronus was haunted by fear. His father Uranus's curse echoed in his mind constantly. He too would be overthrown by his own children. Every time he thought of the future, this prophecy dominated his thoughts, filling him with dread and paranoia. Rhea, his sister wife, began to bear children, and with each pregnancy, Cronus's fear intensified. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Hestia, Cronus looked upon the infant and saw not a helpless baby, but a future threat to his power. And so, driven by the prophecy and by his own fearful nature, Cronus did something terrible. He took the infant Hestia from Rhea's arms and swallowed her whole, trapping her inside his own body, where she could never grow to challenge him. Rhea was devastated, but what could she do against the king of the cosmos, who was also her own brother and husband? She pleaded with Cronus, begged him to reconsider, but he was adamant. The prophecy had to be thwarted, and this was the only way he could think of to prevent his children from overthrowing him. When Rhea gave birth to her second child, a daughter named Demeter, the same terrible scene repeated itself. Cronus took the infant and swallowed her, trapping her inside himself just as he had done with Hestia. Then came Hera, the third child, and she too was swallowed. Then Hades, a son who would one day rule the underworld, and he suffered the same fate. Then Poseidon, another son destined to be lord of the seas, and he too disappeared down his father's throat. 5 children Rhea had borne, and 5 children Cronus had swallowed. The children were not dead, for gods cannot truly die, but they were trapped in a kind of suspended existence, neither living nor dead, conscious but helpless, imprisoned in the belly of their own father. They remained there, ungrowing and unchanging, while Cronus continued to rule and Rhea continued to mourn. But when Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, she decided that she could not bear to lose another child. This time, she would find a way to save her baby from Cronus's terrible hunger. She went to her mother Gaia and to Uranus, seeking their advice and help in deceiving Cronus. They told her of a place where she could hide when the time came to give birth, a place far from Cronus's all-seeing eyes. When Rhea felt her labor beginning, she fled to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, or in some versions, to Mount Decte. There, in the darkness and secrecy of the cave, she gave birth to her 6th child, a son whom she named Zeus. He was a strong, healthy baby, destined for greatness, but first he had to survive infancy, had to be protected from his father's paranoid hunger. Rhea entrusted the baby Zeus to the care of several groups of protectors. The Curettes, young warriors, who served Rhea, were tasked with guarding the cave. Whenever baby Zeus cried, as all babies do, the Curettes would clash their spears against their shields and dance wildly, creating such a din that Zeus's cries could not be heard by anyone who might report back to Cronus. The baby was nursed by the nymph Melissa, who fed him honey, and by the she-goat Amalthea, who gave him her milk. Some versions of the story say that Amalthea was actually a nymph who owned the goat. But either way, Zeus grew strong on goat's milk and honey, hidden in his cave, protected by the Curettes and watched over by Rhea whenever she could steal away from Cronus's court to check on her son. But Rhea still had to return to Cronus, and she knew he would expect her to present him with their newest child, so that he could swallow it as he had swallowed all the others. So Rhea, following advice given by Gaia, found a large stone and wrapped it in swaddling clothes, making it look like a baby wrapped in blankets. Then she returned to Cronus and presented him with this bundle, telling him it was their newborn son. Cronus, so consumed by his fear and so confident in his own strategy of swallowing his children, did not examine the bundle carefully. He simply took what he believed to be his latest child and swallowed the stone whole, just as he had swallowed the 5 children before. The stone settled into his belly alongside his imprisoned children, and Cronus believed he had once again thwarted the prophecy. Meanwhile, Zeus grew up in his cave in Crete, hidden from the world, nursed by Amalthea and protected by the Chariot. Various other beings also played roles in his upbringing. Some stories say that 2 nymphs, Adrastea and Ida, helped care for him. Others mentioned involvement of the Melissae, honey-gathering nymphs who fed him. Some versions include a golden cradle hung from a tree, so that Zeus was neither in the sky, nor on the earth, nor in the sea, making him invisible to his father, who ruled all 3 realms. As Zeus grew from infancy to childhood to adolescence, he was educated by various teachers. Some sources credit the wise Titan Medes, whose name means cunning or wise counsel, with educating the young god. Others speak of the centaur Chiron or various nymphs who taught him about the world, about history, about the nature of the cosmos and his place in it. Zeus learned about his father, about the Titans and their rule, and about his siblings trapped in Cronus's belly. He learned about the prophecy that said Cronus would be overthrown by his children, and he understood that he was the fulfillment of that prophecy, the one who had escaped his father's attempted infanticide, and who would one day set things right. As Zeus approached adulthood, he began to plan. He knew he could not simply march up to Cronus and demand his siblings' release. Cronus was immensely powerful, backed by the other Titans, and Zeus was still young and alone. He needed allies, he needed a strategy, and most of all, he needed to free his siblings who remained trapped inside their father. It was Metis, the Titaness of wisdom and cunning, who provided Zeus with the means to achieve this. Some sources say that Metis had fallen in love with Zeus, seeing in him the potential for greatness and the seeds of the prophecy's fulfillment. Others suggest that she was simply opposed to Cronus's tyrannical rule and saw Zeus as the best hope for change. Whatever her motivations, Metis prepared a powerful potion, a mixture of nectar and mustard or other emetic substances that would cause even a god to vomit. The next challenge was getting Cronus to drink this potion. Here the stories diverge, offering different accounts of how this was accomplished. In some versions, Metis herself approached Cronus, perhaps disguised or using some pretense, and offered him the drink. In others, Zeus approached his father directly, perhaps claiming to be a cupbearer or using some other ruse to get close enough to serve Cronus the poisoned drink. In still others, Rhea herself, finally able to act against her husband after so many years of helpless complicity, convinced Cronus to drink the potion. However it was accomplished, Cronus drank the potion that Metis had prepared, and almost immediately he began to feel violently ill. His stomach cramped and churned, and he began to retch uncontrollably. First, he vomited up the stone that Rhea had given him wrapped in swaddling clothes. The stone, he had believed, was Zeus. The stone flew from his mouth and landed on the earth, and later it would be set up at Delphi as a monument, a reminder of Cronus's deception and eventual defeat. But Cronus's vomiting did not stop with the stone. Next came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia. emerging in reverse order from how they had been swallowed. The gods had been trapped in their father's belly for years, perhaps decades or centuries, depending on how one measures divine time, but they emerged fully grown and unharmed, preserved perfectly in their suspended state of existence. Zeus's 5 siblings stood before him, grateful for their liberation and immediately aware of what needed to happen next. Cronus had to be deposed, the titan who had overthrown his own father, who had ruled through fear and paranoia, who had devoured his own children to preserve his power, could not be allowed to continue his reign. The prophecy that Uranus had spoken, the curse that had haunted Cronus through all his years of power, was finally coming true. But dethroning Cronus and the Titans would not be easy. It would require a war, a conflict so vast and so terrible that it would shake the foundations of the cosmos itself. The stage was set for the Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympians and the Titans, a war that would determine the fate of the universe and establish the order that would govern gods and mortals for all the ages to come. The Titanomachy, war for the cosmos. The war between the Olympians and the Titans was not a brief conflict or a single decisive battle. It was a grinding, exhausting struggle that lasted for 10 full years, a decade of constant warfare that threatened to tear the very fabric of the cosmos apart. On one side stood the Titans, led by Cronus, established in their power, experienced in ruling, and commanding the loyalty of most of the older generation of gods. On the other side stood the Olympians, the 6 children of Cronus and Rhea, young and inexperienced, but filled with righteous anger and the confidence that came from knowing they were fulfilling a prophecy. The war began almost immediately after Zeus freed his siblings from Cronus's belly. There was no time for negotiation or diplomacy, no possibility of peaceful resolution. Cronus had demonstrated his nature clearly through his actions, and Zeus and his siblings knew that they could never be safe as long as their father remained in power. For Cronus's part, the emergence of his children represented the fulfillment of his greatest fear, the realization of the curse that Uranus had laid upon him. He had no choice but to fight, to try to maintain his power against the children who sought to take it from him. The 6 Olympians established their base on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, a mountain so tall that its summit touched the heavens themselves. From here, Zeus and his siblings planned their strategy and launched their attacks against the Titans, who were based on Mount Othrys to the south. The geography of Greece itself became a battlefield, with the divine armies clashing across the mountains and valleys, their struggles causing earthquakes and storms that reshaped the landscape. But despite their youth and vigor, despite Zeus's natural leadership and the Olympians' desire for victory, the war did not go well for them at first. The Titans were simply more experienced, more numerous, and better equipped. They had ruled for an age, and they knew how to wield power effectively. Time and again, the Olympians would launch attacks on the Titans' positions, and time and again, they would be repelled with heavy losses. Zeus realized that if the Olympians were going to win this war, they needed allies. They needed to even the odds, to bring new forces into the conflict that could match the Titans' advantages. And Zeus knew where to find such allies. He remembered what Gaia had told him about the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires. those children of Uranus and Gaia who had been imprisoned in Tartarus by Uranus and kept there even after Cronus came to power. So Zeus made a daring journey down into the depths of Tartarus, that terrible abyss far beneath the earth where light never penetrated and where the imprisoned languished in eternal darkness. He found the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires there, chained and guarded, just as they had been for ages beyond counting. Zeus freed them, breaking their bonds and leading them up from the depths into the light of day. The Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires were grateful for their liberation, and they swore their allegiance to Zeus and the Olympians. The Cyclopes, those master craftsmen with their single eyes and incredible skill, immediately set to work forging weapons for the gods. For Zeus, they crafted his famous thunderbolts, weapons of such power that they could blast through mountains and shake the heavens themselves. These thunderbolts became Zeus's signature weapon, the source of his title as the god of thunder and lightning, and they would prove crucial in the war against the Titans. For Poseidon, the Cyclopes forged a mighty trident, a three-pronged spear that could command the seas, cause earthquakes, and shatter rocks. With this trident, Poseidon would eventually become the lord of all the oceans, able to summon storms or calm the waves with a gesture. For Hades, they created a helmet of invisibility called the Helm of Darkness. This helmet allowed its wearer to become completely invisible, unseeable by gods or mortals. With this weapon, Hades could move unseen through the battlefield, striking at enemies who never knew he was there until his blade found them. Armed with these new weapons and bolstered by the addition of the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires to their forces, the Olympians renewed their assault on the Titans. The character of the war changed dramatically. Zeus's thunderbolts rained down from Olympus, blasting the Titans' positions and shattering their defenses. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, causing earthquakes that toppled the Titans' fortifications. Hades, invisible in his helmet, struck from the shadows, sowing confusion and fear among the enemy ranks. But the true game changers were the Hecatonchires, those 100-handed giants with their 50 heads each. In battle, each of them could hurl hundreds of boulders at once, pelting the Titans with such a barrage of stones that they could hardly defend themselves. The ancient sources describe how Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges would station themselves on the battlefield and rain rocks down on the Titans like a deadly storm, each of their 100 hands launching massive boulders with devastating accuracy. The Titans fought desperately, knowing that defeat would mean the end of their rule and probably their imprisonment or destruction. Cronus himself led them in battle, using all his cunning and power to try to turn the tide. The other Titans, his brothers and sisters, fought alongside him. Atlas, the son of Iapetus, proved to be one of the Titans' most formidable warriors, holding the line against the Olympian assault again and again. The cosmos itself suffered from this divine warfare. The ancient poets describe how the very earth groaned to the impact of the gods' battles, how the seas boiled and the mountains shook, how the sky itself seemed ready to collapse. The heat from Zeus's thunderbolts was so intense that it was said to make the earth melt like tin. The noise of the battle was so loud that it echoed through all the levels of existence, from the highest heaven to the deepest depths of Tartarus. The war raged for 10 years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. But slowly, gradually, the advantage shifted toward the Olympians. The Titan's strength began to fail, worn down by constant assault, and unable to match the devastating power of Zeus's thunderbolts and the Hecatoncheirus' endless barrage of stones. The Olympians, younger and more vigorous, maintained their intensity, pushing forward relentlessly, giving the Titans no time to rest or recover. Finally, after a decade of warfare, the Olympians mounted a massive final assault. Zeus unleashed his most powerful thunderbolts, blasting away the last of the Titans' defenses. The Hecatoncheirus hurled mountains at the enemy, crushing the Titans' formations. Poseidon struck the earth repeatedly with his trident, causing earthquakes that swallowed up entire battalions of Titan warriors. Hades struck from the shadows, cutting down Titan after Titan with his sword, while remaining invisible in his helm of darkness. The Titans broke, their lines crumbled, their formations scattered, and they began to flee from the battlefield. But there was nowhere for them to go, nowhere safe from the Olympians' wrath. Zeus and his siblings pursued the fleeing Titans, hunting them down one by one, until finally Cronus himself was cornered and defeated. What happened to Cronus after his defeat is told differently in different sources. Some say Zeus killed him, ending his father's life as punishment for all his crimes. Others say Cronus was imprisoned in Tartarus, along with the other Titans, trapped in that deep abyss just as he had once trapped the Cyclops and Hecatoncheirus. Still other versions, perhaps trying to soften the patricide, claim that Cronus was eventually released and sent to rule over the islands of the Blessed, where he governed in peace over the souls of the heroic dead. Most of the defeated Titans were indeed cast into Tartarus, that terrible prison far below the earth. Zeus commanded the Hecatoncheirus to serve as their jailers, ensuring that the Titans could never escape and threaten the new order that the Olympians were establishing. There, in eternal darkness, the Titans would remain, punished for their resistance to the inevitable change that the prophecy had foretold. But not all Titans were punished. Some had remained neutral during the war, refusing to fight on either side. Others had actually sided with the Olympians against Cronus. These Titans were allowed to keep their freedom and even their positions of honor. Oceanus, for instance, who had not fought in the war, was allowed to continue ruling over the great river that encircled the world. Themis, the Titaness of divine law, became one of Zeus's advisors and consorts. Prometheus, son of the Titan Iapetus, had sided with Zeus and provided crucial advice during the war, and he was rewarded with freedom and honor, at least initially. Atlas, however, received a special punishment. He had been one of the Titans' greatest warriors, and Zeus decided to make an example of him. Atlas was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky on his shoulders for all eternity, bearing the weight of the heavens as punishment for his role in the war. There he would remain, a constant reminder of what happened to those who opposed Zeus. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, the three sons of Cronus divided the cosmos among themselves. They drew lots to determine who would rule which domain. Zeus drew the lot that gave him the sky and the upper air, and with it, supremacy over the other gods. He became the king of the gods, ruler of Mount Olympus, lord of thunder and lightning, and the ultimate authority over all that happened in the cosmos. Poseidon drew the lot that made him lord of the seas. All the oceans, rivers, and waters of the world fell under his domain, and he established his palace in the depths of the Aegean Sea, where he lived with the Nereids, the sea nymphs, and commanded the sea creatures. Hades drew the lot that gave him the underworld, the realm of the dead. This was not seen as a lesser prize, despite its gloomy nature. The underworld was vast and contained all the souls of the dead, making Hades one of the wealthiest gods, for all the precious metals and gems were in his domain beneath the earth. But Hades' role as Lord of the Dead would keep him separate from the other gods, rarely attending the councils on Olympus, always dwelling in his dark realm below. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were declared common ground, shared by all the gods, though Zeus's authority as king of the gods gave him ultimate say over what happened there. The war was over, the Titans had fallen, a new order had been established. The Olympians now ruled the cosmos, and Zeus sat on the throne of power, just as the prophecy had foretold. But the challenges to Zeus's rule were not over. The defeat of the Titans was not the end of the struggles for control of the cosmos. New threats would emerge. New battles would have to be fought before the Olympian order could truly be secure and the age of the gods could begin in earnest. Reverend Frau, the Olympian order and its challenges, with the defeat of the Titans and the division of the cosmos among Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, a new age began. This was the age of the Olympian gods, so called because they made their home on Mount Olympus, that highest peak whose summit pierced the clouds and touched the very heavens. Here, in palaces of marble and gold, dwelling in splendor unimaginable to mortals, the 12 Olympians established their court and began the rule that would govern the cosmos for all the ages to come. The 12 Olympians, those gods who would become the primary deities of Greek religion and the main characters in most of the myths, were Zeus himself, king of the gods and lord of the sky; Hera, Zeus's wife and sister, goddess of marriage and queen of the gods; Poseidon, lord of the seas and earthquakes; Demeter, goddess of the harvest and agriculture; Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; Apollo, god of light, music, prophecy, and healing; Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the wilderness; Ares, god of war and bloodlust; Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty; Hephaestus, god of fire and the forge; Hermes, god of travelers, thieves, and messengers; and Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. Not all of these gods were children of Cronus and Rhea. In fact, only Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Demeter belonged to that original generation of Olympians who had been swallowed and then regurgitated by Cronus. The other 8 were children, or, in Aphrodite's case, a creation born from different circumstances. But all of them were powerful, all had their domains and their worshippers, and all played crucial roles in the myths and the lives of mortals. Zeus, as king of the gods, was not content with just one wife. Despite being married to Hera, he had numerous affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women, producing countless children who would become heroes, gods, and founders of great lineages. His first consort, even before Hera, was the Titaness Medes, she who had helped him defeat Cronus by providing the potion that made his father vomit up his children. Zeus loved Metis for her wisdom and her cunning, but he received a prophecy that troubled him greatly. It was said that Metis would bear 2 children, first a daughter who would equal Zeus in wisdom, and then a son who would be more powerful than Zeus himself. and would eventually overthrow him. This prophecy echoed the curse that Uranus had laid on Cronus, the pattern of sons overthrowing fathers that seemed woven into the very fabric of divine succession. Zeus decided he could not allow this prophecy to come true. When Metis became pregnant, Zeus tricked her into transforming herself into a fly, and then he swallowed her, trapping her inside himself, just as his father Cronus had swallowed his children. But Metis was already pregnant, and the child continued to develop inside Zeus. Eventually, Zeus began to suffer from terrible headaches, pains so intense that they made even the king of the gods cry out in agony. Hephaestus, the divine smith, took his axe and, at Zeus's command, struck the king of the gods on the head, splitting open his skull. From this wound emerged Athena, fully grown and fully armed, clad in golden armor and carrying a spear and shield. She let out a battle cry that shook Olympus, and the other gods looked on in amazement at this new goddess, who had been born from Zeus's own head. Athena became Zeus's favorite child, inheriting her mother's wisdom and adding to it her own skills in warfare and strategic thinking. And because she was a daughter, not a son, Zeus did not fear the prophecy about being overthrown, at least not from this source. Zeus's marriage to Hera was tempestuous and complicated. Hera was immensely proud and jealous, and she spent much of her time punishing Zeus's lovers and illegitimate children, even though these affairs were really her husband's fault. The myths are filled with stories of Hera's vengeance against women who caught Zeus's eye, and against the children born from these unions. She sent madness to drive them insane, transformed them into animals, hounded them with monsters, and generally made their lives miserable. Yet, despite all this conflict, Hera remained queen of the gods, Zeus's legitimate wife, and the goddess who presided over marriage and family. From his union with Hera came several children. Ares, the god of war, inherited his father's power, but also a certain brutish quality that made him less honored than other gods. Where Athena represented strategic warfare and wisdom in battle, Ares represented the bloodlust and violence of combat, the chaos of the battlefield. Hephaestus was another son of Zeus and Hera, though some sources say Hera bore him alone, in retaliation for Zeus producing Athena from his own head. Hephaestus was born lame, and Hera, ashamed of his deformity, threw him from Olympus. He survived the fall and grew up to become the greatest craftsman among the gods, but he never quite forgave his mother for her rejection. Zeus had other children by various consorts. By Leto, a Titaness, he fathered the twins Apollo and Artemis. By the Pleiad Maia, he fathered Hermes. By Semele, a mortal princess, he fathered Dionysus, though that birth was complicated and traumatic. Each of these children would become major Olympian deities, worshipped throughout the Greek world, with temples and festivals dedicated to them. But Zeus's rule was not secure simply because he had won the war against the Titans. New challenges emerged, new threats to the Olympian order that had to be defeated before the gods could truly rest easy in their power. The first of these challenges came from the giants, another set of children born to Gaia. Gaia, though she had helped Zeus overthrow Cronus, was angry about the treatment of her Titan children. Zeus had cast most of them into Tartarus, imprisoning them in darkness, and this troubled Mother Earth. From her anger and from the blood of Uranus that had fallen on her, When Cronus castrated him, Gaia brought forth a new race of beings, the giants, or gigantes. These giants were not merely large humans. They were monstrous beings of incredible size and strength, with the lower bodies of serpents and wild, unkempt hair and beards. There were many of them, dozens perhaps, each one a formidable opponent even for the gods. They were born fully armed and fully grown, and they immediately set about making war on the Olympians. This conflict, known as the Gigantomachy, was another devastating war that threatened to destroy the newly established order. The giants were powerful enough that the gods could not easily defeat them. Moreover, there was a prophecy that said the giants could not be killed by gods alone. A mortal hero would have to participate in their deaths for the giants to truly die. Zeus called upon his son Heracles, the greatest of all mortal heroes, to aid the gods in this war. Heracles, with his tremendous strength and his experience in combat, proved crucial to the Olympians' victory. Time and again, he would wound a giant with his arrows, and then one of the gods would finish the creature off. Zeus blasted giants with his thunderbolts. Poseidon tore off part of an island and buried a giant beneath it. Athena struck down giants with her spear. Apollo shot them with his silver arrows. The battle raged across Greece, and the earth ran red with the blood of giants. Eventually, the Olympians and Heracles triumphed. The giants were all slain or buried beneath mountains where they could trouble the gods no more. Some say that volcanic eruptions are caused by giants trapped beneath the earth, still struggling to escape and renew their war against the Olympians. Gaia, seeing her giant children defeated, retreated into herself, and though she would continue to play a role in divine politics, she never again directly challenged Zeus's rule. But there was one more great challenge to Zeus's power, perhaps the most dangerous of all. This came from Typhon, a monster so terrible that even the gods feared him. Typhon was, depending on the source, either another child of Gaia, born from her anger at the defeat of the giants, or the offspring of Gaia and Tartarus, combining earth and abyss into a single terrifying being. Typhon was the largest creature that had ever existed, so tall that his head brushed the stars. He had 100 dragon heads growing from his shoulders, each head breathing fire and speaking in the voices of various animals. His lower body was a mass of coils and serpents. His eyes blazed with fire, and his roars could shatter mountains. Where he walked, the earth burned and cracked beneath his feet. He was destruction incarnate, chaos given physical form. When Typhon attacked Olympus, even the gods were terrified. Many of them fled, transforming themselves into animals and hiding in Egypt, unable or unwilling to face this terrible monster. But Zeus could not flee. He was king of the gods, and his rule depended on his ability to protect Olympus and maintain order. So Zeus armed himself with his thunderbolts and went forth to face Typhon. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was cataclysmic. Zeus hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt at the monster, while Typhon breathed fire and lashed out with his 100 heads, each one trying to tear Zeus apart. The earth shook from their combat. Mountains were leveled. The seas boiled. The sky itself seemed ready to split open from the violence of their struggle. At first, Typhon seemed to be winning. He actually managed to overpower Zeus, wrapping his coils around the king of the gods and pinning him down. Then Typhon did something even more terrible. He cut out Zeus's sinews, the divine tendons that gave Zeus his strength, and hid them in a cave, leaving Zeus helpless and defeated. But Hermes and Aegipan, a minor deity associated with Pan, managed to sneak into the cave where Typhon had hidden Zeus's sinews. They stole the sinews back and returned them to Zeus, restoring his strength. Zeus returned to the battle more determined than ever to destroy this monster that had nearly defeated him. The final battle took place in Cilicia in Asia Minor. Zeus rained down thunderbolts on Typhon, then relentlessly battering the monster with divine lightning. Eventually, despite Typhon's incredible strength and resilience, the cumulative damage became too much. Zeus struck Typhon with a final massive thunderbolt that sent the monster reeling backward. Then, mustering all his divine strength, Zeus picked up Mount Etna, the volcano in Sicily, and hurled it down on top of Typhon, burying the monster beneath countless tons of rock. Typhon was trapped beneath Mount Etna, pinned there for all eternity. Some say he is still there, and that volcanic eruptions are caused by Typhon breathing fire in his prison, still raging against his defeat, still trying unsuccessfully to escape and renew his war against Zeus. With Typhon's defeat, the last great challenge to Zeus's rule had been overcome. The Olympian order was now secure. Zeus sat on his throne on Olympus, supreme among the gods, wielding his thunderbolts and maintaining cosmic order. The other Olympians took their places beside him, each with their own domain and their own responsibilities. Hera presided over marriage and family. Athena advised Zeus with her wisdom. Apollo brought light and music and prophecy. Artemis protected the wilderness and the young. Poseidon ruled the seas from his underwater palace. Hades governed the dead in his dark realm. Demeter ensured the harvest. Hermes carried messages between gods and mortals. Ares embodied warfare. Aphrodite inspired love. Hephaestus forged the gods' weapons and treasures. Dionysus brought wine and religious ecstasy. This was the divine order that would govern the cosmos for all the ages to come, the pantheon that the Greeks would worship, the gods whose stories would be told and retold through countless generations. The age of chaos and succession wars was over. The age of the Olympians had truly begun. There were the ages of mankind and Prometheus. With the divine order established and the gods secure in their rule on Olympus, it was time for the next great development in the cosmos, the creation of mankind. But the story of humanity's origin and early history is complicated, involving different ages and different creations, each generation of humans rising and falling according to patterns set by the gods and fate. The ancient Greeks believed that humanity had not appeared all at once in a single act of creation, but rather that there had been multiple generations of human beings, each one different from the last, each age declining in quality from the one before. The poet Hesiod, who lived around 700 years before the Common Era, described 5 ages of mankind, 5 distinct eras in human history, each named for the material that characterized it. The first age was the Golden Age, and it occurred during the time when the Titans ruled before Zeus and the Olympians came to power. The humans of this age were created by the Titans, perhaps by Cronus himself, or perhaps they simply emerged naturally from the earth during this era of perfection and peace. These first humans lived almost like gods. They did not have to work, for the earth provided everything they needed spontaneously. They never grew old or sick. They had no conflicts or wars among themselves. When their time finally came to die, they simply fell asleep peacefully and never woke up, passing from life to death with no suffering or fear. After death, the humans of the Golden Age became spirits, guardians who watched over later generations of mankind and dispensed fortune and misfortune according to the behavior of those they observed. They were blessed and honored, existing in a kind of middle state between mortality and divinity. The second age was the Silver Age, and it was inferior to the Golden Age in every way. The humans of this age were created by the Olympian gods after Zeus had taken power. They lived for 100 years, but they spent that entire century as children, dependent on their mothers and never reaching maturity. Then, when they finally reached adulthood, they lived only briefly as adults before dying. Moreover, the humans of the Silver Age were foolish and violent. They refused to honor the gods or make proper sacrifices. They fought among themselves constantly. Zeus, angered by their impiety and their refusal to honor the Olympians, destroyed the humans of the Silver Age. Unlike the blessed spirits of the Golden Age, the dead of the Silver Age went underground, becoming lesser spirits, still honored by mortals, but not nearly as blessed as their predecessors. The Third Age was the Bronze Age, and it was marked by violence and warfare. The humans of this age were terrible and strong, created by Zeus from ash trees. They were obsessed with war and violence, and they carried weapons of bronze, lived in houses of bronze, wore armor of bronze. They were so warlike that they eventually destroyed themselves, killing one another in constant warfare until none remained. When they died, they went down to Hades, nameless and unremembered, leaving no legacy behind them. After the Bronze Age came the Age of Heroes, and this represented a brief improvement in human quality. The heroes were demigods, often the children of unions between gods and mortals, and they were nobler and more just than the humans of the Bronze Age. This was the age of the great heroes whose stories fill Greek mythology: Perseus, Theseus, Jason, Heracles, Achilles, Odysseus, and countless others. They performed amazing deeds, slew monsters, and went on epic adventures. But the Age of Heroes was also marked by two great catastrophes that killed many of these noble beings. The war at Thebes, where 7 heroes led armies against the city and died in the attempt, and the Trojan War, that 10-year conflict that destroyed an entire city and killed or scattered the greatest heroes of the age. After they died, some of the heroes went to the Islands of the Blessed, where they lived in a paradise at the edge of the world, while others went down to Hades like ordinary mortals. Finally came the Fifth Age, the Iron Age, the age in which Hesiod himself lived, and which, according to Greek belief, was still ongoing. The Iron Age was characterized by hardship, labor, and suffering. Humans had to work hard to survive. They were plagued by diseases and wars. Justice and honor were rare, and people constantly struggled against each other and against the hardships of existence. Hesiod believed that this age would eventually end with Zeus destroying humanity entirely, perhaps to begin the cycle again, or perhaps to simply end the experiment of mortal life altogether. But running parallel to this story of the 5 ages is another creation myth, one that centers on the Titan Prometheus, whose name means forethought, or the one who thinks ahead. Prometheus was a son of the Titan Iapetus and the Oceanid Clymene, making him a cousin to the Olympian gods rather than a brother. During the Titanomachy, Prometheus had sided with Zeus, providing crucial advice that helped the Olympians defeat the Titans. For this loyalty, Prometheus was honored and given freedom even after most of the Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus. According to some sources, it was Prometheus who actually created humanity. He fashioned the first humans from clay, molding them in the image of the gods, and then Athena breathed life into these clay figures, animating them and giving them souls. Prometheus loved his creations and became humanity's great champion and benefactor, always working to improve their lot and give them the tools they needed to thrive. But Zeus did not love humanity the way Prometheus did. To Zeus, humans were inferior beings, mortals who would live and die in a brief span, barely worthy of notice by the immortal gods. Zeus believed that if humans were to worship the gods and make sacrifices to them, they should know their place and accept their inferior status. There should be a clear hierarchy, with the gods far above and mortals far below. This disagreement came to a head at Makone, where gods and humans gathered to determine how sacrifices should be divided. When an animal was sacrificed, which parts should go to the gods, and which should the humans be allowed to keep? Prometheus was tasked with dividing the sacrifice and setting the precedent for all future offerings. Prometheus, clever and always thinking ahead, decided to trick Zeus to benefit humanity. He took a great ox and butchered it, then divided it into 2 portions. In one portion, he placed all the good meat, the edible parts that provided nourishment, but he wrapped them in the ox's hide and stomach, making the bundle look unappealing. In the other portion, he placed only the bones, which were inedible and worthless, but he wrapped them in rich fat, making this bundle look appetizing and valuable. Then Prometheus invited Zeus to choose which portion the gods would receive in sacrifices, with the understanding that humans would get the other portion. Zeus, seeing through Prometheus's trick, but deciding to play along in order to have an excuse to punish humanity, chose the portion wrapped in fat. He unwrapped it and discovered that it contained only bones, while the humans would get all the good meat. Zeus was furious, though in truth his anger was probably feigned or exaggerated to justify what came next. He declared that since humans would benefit so greatly from sacrifices, keeping all the nutritious meat for themselves, they did not deserve another great gift that the gods had been considering: fire. Zeus decreed that humans would have to live without fire, unable to cook their food, unable to warm themselves in winter, unable to work metals or create the tools and weapons that would allow them to advance beyond a primitive state. But Prometheus, loving humanity and unable to bear seeing his creations suffer in cold and darkness, decided to defy Zeus. He stole fire from the gods, either taking it from Zeus's lightning bolt or from the forge of Hephaestus, depending on which version of the story you follow. He concealed the fire in a hollow fennel stalk and carried it down from Olympus to Earth, where he gave it to humanity. With fire, humans could cook their food, making it more nutritious and easier to digest. They could warm themselves against the cold, allowing them to survive harsh winters. They could work metals, creating tools and weapons that would let them shape their environment and defend themselves against predators. They could see in the darkness, extending their productive hours beyond daylight. Fire represented technology, civilization, the capacity to change and improve the conditions of existence. It was perhaps the greatest gift that could be given to a species, the thing that elevated humans above other animals. But Zeus was enraged by this theft. Fire was the property of the gods, a divine power that should not be shared with mortals. Prometheus had defied the king of the gods, had stolen from Olympus itself, and such defiance could not go unpunished. Zeus ordered that Prometheus be chained to a mountain in the Caucasus, bound there with unbreakable chains forged by Hephaestus. Every day, an eagle would come to where Prometheus was chained, and this eagle would eat Prometheus's liver. Being immortal, Prometheus could not die from this torture, and every night his liver would regenerate, only to be eaten again the next day. This punishment was to continue forever. Eternal torture for the Titan who had dared to help humanity at the expense of divine prerogative. But Zeus was not done with his revenge. He was still angry at humanity for accepting Prometheus's gift, a hymn of fire, and he decided to punish mortals as well. He commanded Hephaestus to create a woman from clay, the first woman, for up until this point, again, according to this version of the myth, humanity consisted only of men. Hephaestus fashioned this woman with great care and skill, making her beautiful and alluring. Athena clothed her in fine garments and taught her domestic skills. Aphrodite gave her grace and charm and desire. Apollo taught her music. Hermes, however, gave her a crafty mind, curiosity, and the capacity for deceit. The gods named her Pandora, which means all gifts, because each of the gods had given her some quality or skill. Then Zeus presented Pandora as a gift to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, whose name means afterthought, or the one who thinks too late. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept any gifts from Zeus, knowing that the king of the gods would use such gifts to bring harm. But Epimetheus, seeing Pandora's beauty and charmed by her grace, accepted her despite his brother's warnings. He took Pandora as his wife, and she came to live among humanity. Pandora brought with her a jar, or, in later versions, a box. Zeus had given it to her with strict instructions never to open it. But Hermes had given Pandora curiosity, and as time passed, she became more and more obsessed with what might be inside the jar. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Pandora opened it. Immediately, all the evils that plague humanity flew out of the jar and spread across the world. Disease and pain, sorrow and suffering, hatred and violence, envy and greed. All the things that make human life difficult and painful poured out from Pandora's jar and infected all of humanity. Only one thing remained at the bottom of the jar: hope. Some interpret this to mean that humans still have hope, even amid all their suffering. That Zeus allowed this one positive thing to remain, to give humans a reason to continue living, despite all the evils they must endure. Others suggest that hope remained trapped in the jar, meaning that humans cannot even hope, that they must face all their sufferings without any expectation of future improvement. This, then, was humanity's situation, according to the Greek myths, created by Prometheus or by the gods, living through successive ages of decline, given the great gift of fire at enormous cost, and plagued by all the evils that Pandora's curiosity released into the world. Humans were mortal, doomed to suffer and die, dependent on the gods, yet often punished by them, capable of great things but limited by their mortal natures. And it was into this complex and often tragic human condition that the heroes would be born, those exceptional mortals who would perform amazing deeds and whose stories would be remembered for all time. If for the great heroes, legends of courage, the age of heroes was filled with remarkable individuals whose deeds echoed through eternity, mortals who accomplished such extraordinary feats that they transcended their human limitations and became legends. These heroes were often the children of gods and mortals, blessed with superhuman strength, courage, or cleverness, but still subject to mortality, still vulnerable to the same flaws and failures that plague all humans. Their stories embodied the Greek ideals of courage, honor, cleverness, and the complex relationship between humans and gods. Perseus was among the earliest of these great heroes, grandson of King Acrisius of Argos. Acrisius had been told by an oracle that he would be killed by his daughter's son. So when his daughter Danae gave birth to Perseus, Acrisius locked both mother and child in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. But Zeus, who was Perseus's father, protected them, and they washed ashore on the island of Seriphos. Perseus grew up strong and brave on Seriphos, and when King Polydectes of the island wanted to marry Danae against her will, he sent Perseus on what he thought would be a fatal quest to bring back the head of Medusa, one of the three Gorgons. Medusa had once been a beautiful woman, but after being ravished by Poseidon in Athena's temple, the goddess had transformed her into a monster. Her hair became writhing snakes, and her gaze could turn any living thing to stone. The gods, perhaps feeling some guilt about what had happened to Medusa, or simply wanting to help Perseus for their own reasons, provided him with magical equipment. Athena gave him a polished shield that could serve as a mirror, allowing him to look at Medusa's reflection without meeting her deadly gaze directly. Hermes provided him with an adamantine sword, sharp enough to cut through anything. Hades lent him his helmet of invisibility. The nymphs gave him winged sandals that would allow him to fly, and a special bag called a kibisis that could safely contain Medusa's severed head. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus found the Gorgons in their lair at the edge of the world. Using Athena's shield to see Medusa's reflection, he was able to approach her while she slept and cut off her head with one clean stroke. From the blood that spilled from her severed neck sprang two beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chryser, a giant with a golden sword. These were Medusa's children by Poseidon, born at the moment of her death. Perseus placed Medusa's head in the kibises and fled, using the winged sandals to escape from Medusa's two immortal sisters, who tried to pursue him and avenge their sister's death. On his journey home, Perseus performed other heroic deeds, including rescuing the princess Andromeda from a sea monster and turning various enemies to stone by showing them Medusa's severed head. Eventually, he returned to Seriphos, rescued his mother from Polydectes' harassment, and went on to found the city of Mycenae. And years later, at athletic games, Perseus accidentally killed his grandfather Acrisius with an errant discus throw, fulfilling the oracle's prophecy, despite all attempts to avoid it. But if Perseus was great, Heracles was the greatest hero of all, the one whose name became synonymous with strength and courage, whose deeds were so numerous and so extraordinary that he was eventually granted immortality and allowed to join the gods on Olympus. Heracles, or Hercules as the Romans would call him, was the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmena. Hera, jealous as always of Zeus's infidelities, hated Heracles from the moment of his birth. She sent 2 serpents to kill him in his cradle, but the infant Heracles strangled them both, showing early the tremendous strength that would characterize his entire life. As Heracles grew to adulthood, Hera continued to torment him. She drove him temporarily mad, causing him to kill his own wife Megara and their children in a fit of insanity. When Heracles recovered his sanity and realized what he had done, he was devastated by grief and guilt. He sought purification and penance for his crimes, and the oracle at Delphi told him that he must serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king demanded of him. Eurystheus, encouraged by Hera, set Heracles 12 tasks that were supposed to be impossible, labors so difficult that they would surely result in the hero's death. The first labor was to kill the Nemean lion, a monstrous beast with hide so thick that no weapon could pierce it. Heracles tracked the lion to its lair, and when he discovered that his arrows and sword were useless against it, he wrestled the creature with his bare hands, eventually strangling it to death. He then skinned the lion using its own claws, the only thing sharp enough to cut through the hide, and from then on wore the lion skin as a cloak, making himself invulnerable to most weapons. The second labor was to kill the Lernaean Hydra, a many-headed water serpent that lived in the swamps of Lerna. The Hydra was incredibly dangerous, not just because of its multiple heads, but because whenever one head was cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. Heracles enlisted the help of his nephew Iolaus. Each time Heracles cut off one of the Hydra's heads, Iolaus would sear the neck with a burning torch, cauterizing the wound and preventing new heads from growing. Finally, Heracles cut off the immortal head in the center and buried it under a massive rock. He then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, making them deadly weapons that would cause wounds that could never heal. The third labor was to capture the golden hind of Artemis, a sacred deer with golden antlers that was beloved by the goddess. Heracles had to be careful not to harm the creature, for killing it would incur Artemis's wrath. He pursued the hind for an entire year across Greece and beyond, before finally capturing it alive and bringing it back to Eurystheus. The fourth labor was to capture the Erymanthian boar, a giant wild pig that was terrorizing the countryside around Mount Erymanthus. Heracles tracked the boar through deep snow, exhausting it, then captured it in a net and brought it back alive to Eurystheus, who was so terrified when he saw the monstrous creature that he hid in a large jar. The fifth labor was to clean the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas of Elis owned vast herds of cattle, and their stables had not been cleaned in 30 years. The accumulated filth was mountainous and seemed impossible to remove in the time allotted. But Heracles, using his cleverness rather than just his strength, diverted 2 rivers to flow through the stables, and the rushing waters swept away all the filth in one day. The sixth labor was to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating birds with bronze beaks and sharp, metallic feathers that they could launch like arrows. These birds infested the swamps around Lake Stymphalus. Athena provided Heracles with a rattle made by Hephaestus, and when Heracles shook this rattle, the noise startled the birds into flight. As they rose into the air, Heracles shot them down with his arrows. The seventh labor was to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent beast that was ravaging the island of Crete. This was the same bull that Poseidon had sent to King Minos, and that would later father the Minotaur. Heracles wrestled the bull into submission, rowed it across the sea back to the Greek mainland, and presented it to Eurystheus before releasing it. The bull would eventually make its way to Marathon, where Theseus would later have to deal with it. The eighth labor was to steal the mares of Diomedes, 4 horses that belonged to the Thracian king Diomedes, and that were fed on human flesh, making them savage and uncontrollable. Heracles defeated Diomedes in battle and fed the tyrant king to his own horses, which calmed them enough that Heracles could bring them back to Eurystheus. The ninth labor was to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, the belt worn by the queen of the Amazons. Heracles traveled to the land of the Amazons with a company of heroes, including Theseus. Hippolyta was actually willing to give Heracles the belt peacefully, but Hera, disguised as an Amazon, spread rumors that Heracles was planning to kidnap the queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the ensuing battle, Heracles killed Hippolyta and took her girdle. The 10th labor was to steal the cattle of Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies who lived on the island of Erythea at the western edge of the world. Heracles had to journey to the very edge of the known world, killing Geryon and his herdsmen and his 2-headed guard dog, before driving the cattle all the way back across Europe and the Mediterranean to Greece. The 11th labor was to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. These were apples that granted immortality, growing in a garden at the edge of the world, guarded by the Hesperides nymphs, and by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon. Heracles enlisted the help of Atlas, the titan who held up the sky. Atlas agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would hold the sky in his place. Atlas got the apples, but then didn't want to take the sky back. Heracles tricked Atlas into resuming his burden by asking him to hold the sky for just a moment, while Heracles adjusted the pad on his shoulders. And then Heracles took the apples and left. The 12th and final labor was to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld. Heracles had to descend into Hades' realm, convince the god of the dead to allow him to attempt this feat, and then wrestle Cerberus into submission, using only his strength without weapons. Heracles succeeded, brought Cerberus to the surface to show Eurystheus, and then returned the hound to the underworld. Beyond these 12 labors, Heracles had many other adventures. He sailed with the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece. He fought the centaurs at the wedding of Pirithous. He wrestled death itself to save the wife of his friend Admetus. He sacked the city of Troy a generation before the famous Trojan War. His life was filled with constant action, constant struggle, constant proof of his exceptional nature. But Heracles' life also had tragedy. He killed his music teacher Linus in a fit of anger. His second wife, Deianira, accidentally poisoned him with a shirt soaked in the Hydra's blood, believing it was a love charm that would keep Heracles faithful. The poison caused Heracles such agonizing pain that he built a funeral pyre on Mount Oida and lay down on it to burn to death, preferring a quick death by fire to the prolonged agony of the poison. But as the flames consumed his mortal body, Zeus intervened. He brought Heracles up to Olympus, where the hero was granted immortality and married to Hebe, the goddess of youth. Heracles became a god, worshipped throughout Greece, the only mortal to achieve full divinity through his own deeds and suffering. Jason was another great hero, prince of Iolcus in Thessaly, whose quest for the Golden Fleece became one of the most famous stories in Greek mythology. His uncle Peleus had usurped the throne that should have been Jason's, and when Jason came of age and demanded his birthright, Peleus agreed to give up the throne if Jason would first bring him the Golden Fleece, the hide of a magical flying ram that hung in a sacred grove in Colchis at the eastern edge of the world. Jason assembled a crew of the greatest heroes of the age, including Heracles, Theseus, Orpheus the legendary, musician Castor and Pollux, Atalanta the huntress, and many others. They sailed on the ship Argo, and so they became known as the Argonauts. Their journey to Colchis was filled with adventures and dangers. They fought the harpies that tormented the prophet Phineas. They survived the clashing rocks that crushed ships trying to pass between them. They faced various monsters and hostile peoples. When they reached Colchis, King Ides agreed to give Jason the Golden Fleece if he could complete several impossible tasks: yoke fire-breathing bulls and plow a field with them, then plant dragon's teeth in the furrows, and defeat the armed warriors that would spring from the planted teeth. Jason would have failed, but Medea, the king's daughter and a powerful sorceress, fell in love with him and helped him complete the tasks. She also helped him steal the Golden Fleece by putting the sleepless dragon that guarded it into an enchanted sleep. Jason and Medea fled Colchis with the fleece, pursued by Ides and his forces. Medea's help in escaping was so terrible that it revealed the dark side of her love. She killed her own brother Absyrtus and scattered his body parts in the sea, forcing her father to stop and collect them for burial, giving Jason and the Argonauts time to escape. When they returned to Iolcus, Peleus refused to honor his promise. Medea helped Jason again by tricking Peleus's daughters into killing their father, claiming she could rejuvenate him, but actually causing his death. But this crime forced Jason and Medea to flee, and they eventually settled in Corinth, where they lived together for years and had children. But Jason, either out of political ambition or because he had stopped loving Medea, decided to marry Glauce, the daughter of Corinth's king. Medea, enraged by this betrayal, after everything she had sacrificed for Jason, took terrible revenge. She sent Glauce a poisoned dress that burned the princess alive, along with her father who tried to save her. Then, most horrifically, Medea killed her own children by Jason, robbing him of his heirs and ensuring that he would live the rest of his life in grief and regret. These were but a few of the great heroes of Greek mythology. Theseus united Attica and slew the Minotaur. Bellerophon rode the winged horse Pegasus and killed the Chimera. Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx and unwittingly fulfilled the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, bringing tragedy upon himself and his family. Atalanta ran faster than any man and hunted with skill equal to Artemis. Each hero had their tale, their moment of glory, their triumph over impossible odds, and often their tragic fate. The age of heroes demonstrated both the heights humans could reach and the depths to which they could fall. These were individuals who accomplished things that seemed beyond mortal capacity, who stood as equals to monsters and sometimes even to gods, who left legacies that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. Yet they also showed the essential tragedy of the human condition. No matter how great their deeds, they remained mortal, subject to death, vulnerable to the same passions and flaws that affected ordinary humans. Their glory was real, but it was also temporary, a bright flame that burned intensely, but inevitably went out, leaving only stories behind. For us to fear the Trojan War, the greatest conflict of all the events in Greek mythology, none was more significant or more extensively told than the Trojan War, that 10-year conflict that destroyed a great city and killed or scattered the greatest heroes of the age. The war's causes stretched back through generations, involving prophecies, divine machinations, and the complicated relationships between gods and mortals. Its effects resonated forward through time, shaping the future of Greece and providing endless material for poets, dramatists, and storytellers. The seeds of the Trojan War were planted at the wedding of Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a Nereid or sea nymph. This was an unusual marriage, for Thetis was divine while Peleus was mortal, and the match came about because of a prophecy. It had been foretold that Thetis would bear a son, who would be greater than his father. Zeus and Poseidon had both been pursuing Thetis, but when they learned of this prophecy, they withdrew their suits, not wanting to father a son who might overthrow them. Instead, the gods arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal, ensuring that her son, though great, would not threaten the divine order. All the gods and goddesses were invited to the wedding feast except one, Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Angry at being excluded, Eris decided to cause trouble at the celebration. She threw into the midst of the festivities a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," or, in some versions, "For the most beautiful." Immediately, 3 goddesses claimed the apple: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each believed herself to be the most beautiful goddess, and therefore deserving of the apple. The goddesses argued about who should receive the apple, and eventually they decided that someone needed to judge between them. They chose Paris, a prince of Troy, who was at that moment living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, unaware of his true identity. Paris had been abandoned on the mountain as an infant because of a prophecy that he would bring about the destruction of Troy, but he had been rescued and raised by shepherds, growing into a handsome young man, known for his fairness in judgment. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, and each offered him a bribe in exchange for declaring her the fairest. Hera offered him power, dominion over all of Asia if he chose her. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in warfare, promising that he would become the greatest warrior who ever lived if he selected her. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris, young and probably more interested in love than in power or glory, chose Aphrodite. He gave her the golden apple, declaring her the fairest of the goddesses. Aphrodite was delighted with her victory, while Hera and Athena were enraged, vowing that they would have their revenge on Paris and on Troy. This judgment of Paris set in motion the events that would lead to the Trojan War. The most beautiful woman in the world, whom Aphrodite had promised to Paris, was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, and wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen was so beautiful that when she had come of age, every prince and king in Greece had wanted to marry her. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus, had worried that choosing one suitor would anger all the others and lead to war. So he had made all the suitors swear an oath that they would defend Helen's chosen husband against anyone who might try to take her away. They all swore this oath, and Tyndareus chose Menelaus to be Helen's husband. But now, Paris, with Aphrodite's help, traveled to Sparta and was received as a guest in Menelaus's palace. While there, he seduced Helen, or perhaps Aphrodite caused her to fall in love with him, or perhaps Paris simply kidnapped her by force. The sources vary on exactly how willing Helen was to leave with Paris, but leave she did, abandoning her husband and her daughter Hermione to sail with Paris back to Troy. When Menelaus discovered that his wife had been taken, he was furious. He called upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece, to help him get Helen back. Agamemnon agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to demonstrate his power and perhaps to plunder the wealthy city of Troy. They sent messengers to all the Greek kings and princes who had sworn the oath to defend Menelaus's marriage, calling them to honor their vow. The greatest heroes of Greece answered the call. Achilles, son of Peleus, and Thetis, the greatest warrior of his generation, came with his Myrmidons. Ajax the Greater and Ajax the Lesser, both formidable warriors, joined the expedition. Diomedes, Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, old Nestor, whose wisdom was valued as highly as any warrior's strength, and many others all gathered at Aulis, where a fleet of over 1,000 ships was assembled to sail to Troy and bring Helen back. But the fleet was delayed at Aulis by unfavorable winds that prevented the ships from sailing. The prophet Calchas revealed that Artemis was angry because Agamemnon had killed one of her sacred deer, and boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess. To appease Artemis and gain favorable winds, Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. After much anguish and debate, Agamemnon agreed to this terrible price. He sent for Iphigenia under the pretense that she would be married to Achilles. When she arrived, she was taken to the altar to be sacrificed. But at the last moment, according to some versions, Artemis took pity on the girl and substituted a deer on the altar, spiriting Iphigenia away to Taurus, where she would become a priestess. Other versions are darker, insisting that Iphigenia was actually killed, and that this crime would eventually contribute to Agamemnon's own murder when he returned home. With Artemis appeased, the winds became favorable, and the Greek fleet sailed across the Aegean to Troy. They landed on the Trojan shore and laid siege to the great city. Troy was powerfully defended, with high walls that had been built by Poseidon and Apollo, and it was ruled by King Priam, who had many sons, including Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, and Paris, the prince who had caused this whole war by taking Helen. The siege of Troy lasted for 10 years. The Greeks could not breach the city's walls, and the Trojans could not drive the Greeks away. The war became a grinding stalemate, with raids and skirmishes, and occasional major battles, but no decisive victory for either side. Heroes on both sides distinguished themselves in combat. Achilles was the most formidable of the Greek warriors, killing countless Trojans and spreading terror through their ranks. Hector matched him on the Trojan side, rallying the defenders and keeping the Greeks from overrunning the city. The turning point of the war came in the conflict's 10th year, sparked by a quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon. Agamemnon had taken a girl named Chryseis as a war prize, but her father was a priest of Apollo, and when Agamemnon refused to return her, Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek camp. The prophet Calchas revealed that the plague would only end if Chryseis was returned to her father. Agamemnon reluctantly agreed, but he demanded compensation. He took Briseis, a girl who had been given to Achilles as his war prize. Achilles was enraged by this insult. He withdrew from the fighting, taking his myrmidons with him, and refused to participate in the war any longer. He prayed to his mother, Thetis, asking her to petition Zeus to give victory to the Trojans so that the Greeks would realize how much they needed him. Thetis did this, and Zeus agreed to help the Trojans, at least temporarily. Without Achilles, the Greek forces were overwhelmed. Hector led the Trojans in a massive counterattack that drove the Greeks back to their ships. Many Greek heroes were wounded. Diomedes was struck by an arrow. Ajax was injured. Even Odysseus was hurt. The Trojans broke through the Greek fortifications and began burning their ships. Agamemnon, realizing the disaster he had caused, sent ambassadors to Achilles offering magnificent gifts and the return of Briseis if he would come back and fight. But Achilles, still consumed by his anger and his injured pride, refused. The situation became desperate. Patroclus, Achilles' closest friend and companion, could not bear to see the Greeks being slaughtered. He begged Achilles to let him wear Achilles' armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle, thinking that the Trojans would believe Achilles had returned to the fighting and would retreat in fear. Achilles reluctantly agreed, but he warned Patroclus only to drive the Trojans away from the ships and not to pursue them all the way to Troy's walls. Patroclus put on Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans, seeing what they believed to be Achilles, did indeed fall back in terror. Patroclus drove them away from the ships and saved the Greek fleet from destruction. But in his moment of triumph, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the fleeing Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy. There, Hector turned to face him. In the fierce duel that followed, Hector, aided by Apollo, killed Patroclus and stripped Achilles' armor from his body. The Greeks managed to recover Patroclus' corpse, but Hector had won a great victory and now possessed the armor of the Greeks' greatest warrior. When Achilles learned of Patroclus' death, his grief was boundless. He blamed himself for not fighting, for allowing his anger at Agamemnon to keep him from protecting his friend. His rage at Hector for killing Patroclus overwhelmed all other considerations. He immediately reconciled with Agamemnon and vowed to return to battle and kill Hector, no matter what it cost. Thetis, knowing her son would need armor since Hector had taken his, went to Hephaestus and asked the smith god to forge new armor for Achilles. Hephaestus created a magnificent panoply, a helmet, a breastplate, greaves, and most famously, a shield, decorated with elaborate scenes depicting the cosmos, cities at peace and at war, all of human life rendered in imperishable metal. Armed with this divine armor, Achilles re-entered the battle like a force of nature. He slaughtered Trojans by the hundreds, driving them back to their city in terror. He fought the river god's commander when the river's course became choked with the bodies of Achilles' victims. He drove all the Trojans back inside their walls, and only Hector remained outside to face him. 3 times Achilles chased Hector around the walls of Troy before they finally faced each other in single combat. Hector fought bravely, but he was no match for Achilles' rage and skill. Achilles killed him with a spear thrust to the throat. the only vulnerable spot in the armor Hector was wearing, armor that had once belonged to Achilles himself. But Achilles' rage was not satisfied by Hector's death. He desecrated the corpse, tying it to his chariot and dragging it around the walls of Troy, in sight of Hector's father, mother, wife, and all the Trojan people. For days, Achilles dragged Hector's body around Patroclus' tomb, trying to avenge his friend through this continued outrage. But Apollo preserved Hector's body from decay, and eventually the gods sent Priam, Hector's father, to Achilles' tent to ransom his son's body. The meeting between Achilles and Priam is one of the most moving scenes in Greek mythology. The old king knelt before his son's killer and begged for the return of Hector's body so it could be properly buried. Achilles, seeing in Priam his own father Peleus, who he would never see again, was moved to pity. He returned Hector's body and granted a truce so the Trojans could hold funeral games for their greatest hero. But even Achilles could not escape fate. He was killed by Paris, who shot him in the heel with an arrow, the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body. According to legend, when Achilles was an infant, his mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she had held him by his heel, leaving that one spot unprotected. Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, struck this weak point, and the greatest of all Greek warriors died from a wound to his heel. Even after Achilles' death, the war continued. Many other heroes fought and died. Ajax the Greater, driven mad with jealousy and shame, killed himself. Paris was killed by an arrow shot by Philoctetes, but still the city of Troy stood, its walls impregnable, and the Greeks could not breach them. Finally, Odysseus devised the strategy that would end the war: the Trojan horse. The Greeks built a massive wooden horse and left it outside Troy's gates as an apparent offering to the gods. They then pretended to sail away, leaving the horse behind. The Trojans, believing the Greeks had finally given up and sailed home, debated what to do with the horse, despite warnings from Cassandra, a prophetess cursed to tell true prophecies that no one would believe, and from Laocoon, a priest who was killed by serpents sent by Athena. The Trojans decided to bring the horse inside their city as a victory monument. But hidden inside the horse were Greek warriors, including Odysseus. That night, they emerged from the horse, opened Troy's gates to let in the Greek army, which had actually been hiding nearby, and Troy fell at last. The city was burned, its men were killed, its women and children were taken as slaves. King Priam was murdered at the altar where he had sought sanctuary. The baby son of Hector and Andromache was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father. Helen was returned to Menelaus, though whether she went willingly or by force, whether she had gone with Paris willingly or been abducted, whether she should be blamed or pitied, remained matters of debate for the Greeks. The war was over. Troy was destroyed, but the cost had been immense, and the victorious Greeks would find that their troubles were far from finished. The journey home would prove almost as dangerous as the war itself. The underworld and the mystery of death beneath the world of the living, in caverns so deep that no sunlight ever reached them, lay the realm of Hades, the kingdom of the dead. This was not a place of torment for all, as later traditions would sometimes portray it, but rather the destination of all mortal souls regardless of their virtue or wickedness. To die was to descend into Hades' realm, to join the countless shades who existed there. in a twilight state, neither truly alive nor entirely ceased to exist. The geography of the underworld was complex, divided into different regions and traversed by 5 rivers, each named for the quality it represented. The most famous was the Styx, the river of hatred, by which the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths. When a god swore by the Styx and broke that oath, they would lose their voice for 9 years and be exiled from the councils of the gods, suffering a kind of divine death in life. The ferryman Charon transported souls across the Styx, but only if they had been properly buried with a coin placed under their tongue to pay the fare. Those who could not pay were doomed to wander the near shore for 100 years before being allowed to cross. The Acheron was the river of woe or sorrow, and some sources described it as the river that all souls must cross. The Phlegethon was a river of fire burning with flames that never consumed what they touched. The Cocytus was the river of lamentation, where the souls wept for their mortal lives. And the Lethe was the river of forgetfulness, whose waters, when drunk, erased all memory of the life before death. Some souls chose to drink from the Lethe to ease the pain of their existence in the underworld, while others preserved their memories, clinging to the identity they had possessed in life. At the entrance to the underworld stood Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guarded the gates. Cerberus allowed all souls to enter, never stopping anyone from descending into death, but he prevented anyone from leaving, attacking viciously any shade who tried to escape back to the world of the living. Only the greatest heroes, those with divine assistance or extraordinary courage, could pass Cerberus on their way out of the underworld. Once souls had crossed the river and passed Cerberus, they came before 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus. These were men who had been renowned for their justice and wisdom in life, and in death they had been appointed to judge the souls of the dead, determining their fate based on the lives they had lived. For most souls, the judgment was straightforward. They were sent to the Asphodel Meadows, a gray and joyless plain, where the dead wandered as shades, existing but not truly living, conscious but without purpose or pleasure. But some souls received different fates. The truly wicked, those who had committed terrible crimes against the gods or had broken sacred laws, were sent to Tartarus, that deep abyss where the Titans were imprisoned. There they suffered eternal punishment specifically designed to match their crimes. Tantalus, who had killed his own son and served him as food to the gods to test their omniscience, stood forever in a pool of water beneath fruit trees. But whenever he reached for the fruit, it pulled away, and whenever he bent to drink, the water receded, leaving him eternally hungry and thirsty. Sisyphus, who had cheated death itself and revealed the secrets of the gods, was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to have it roll back down just before he reached the top. Ixion, who had tried to seduce Hera, was bound to a flaming wheel that rolled through Tartarus forever. On the other end of the spectrum, those few souls who had been exceptionally virtuous or had been particularly beloved by the gods were sent to Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, a paradise within the underworld where they could live in eternal happiness. The weather was always perfect in Elysium. The meadows were always green, and the blessed dead could spend their time in whatever pursuits had brought them joy in life. Athletic competitions, music, poetry, philosophical discussion, all without the pain or limitation of mortal existence. Some sources spoke of the islands of the blessed, perhaps another name for Elysium, or perhaps a separate paradise reserved for the greatest heroes. These islands lay at the western edge of the world, beyond the river Oceanus, and there the heroic dead lived lives much like those they had enjoyed in the mortal world, but without death or suffering. Hades himself, god of the underworld, was stern but not cruel. He was one of the three sons of Cronus, who had divided the cosmos after the Titanomachy, and he ruled his realm with the same authorities that Zeus wielded in the heavens and Poseidon commanded in the seas. Hades rarely left his kingdom, and when he did, it was usually on grim business. He was wealthy beyond measure, for all the precious metals and gems of the earth were in his domain, and all the dead came to his realm eventually, making him in some ways the richest of all the gods. But Hades was lonely in his dark realm, surrounded by the dead, but without a living consort to share his throne. This loneliness led to one of the most important myths associated with the underworld, the abduction of Persephone. Persephone was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, goddess of the harvest. She was beautiful and innocent, spending her days gathering flowers in meadows with her companions, the nymphs. Hades, seeing her during one of his rare visits to the upper world, fell in love with her beauty. He asked Zeus for permission to marry her, and Zeus, perhaps not thinking through the implications, agreed. One day, as Persephone was gathering flowers in a meadow, the earth suddenly split open. Hades emerged in his chariot, seized Persephone, and carried her down into the underworld. Before she could even cry out for help, the earth closed behind them, leaving no trace of what had happened except for the flowers Persephone had dropped. Demeter, discovering that her daughter had vanished, was frantic with worry. She searched everywhere for Persephone, abandoning her duties as goddess of the harvest to look for her missing child. As Demeter neglected her responsibilities, the earth ceased to be fertile. Crops failed, plants withered and died, and famine began to spread across the world. Humans and animals alike began to starve, and if the situation continued, all life on earth would perish. Finally, Helios, the sun god who sees all that happens, told Demeter what had occurred. He revealed that Hades had abducted Persephone and taken her to the underworld to be his queen. Demeter was enraged, not just at Hades, but at Zeus, who had given permission for this kidnapping. She refused to restore fertility to the earth until her daughter was returned. Zeus, seeing that the world was dying and that countless humans would starve if Demeter did not relent, sent Hermes down to the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. Hades agreed to release her, but before she left, he gave her some pomegranate seeds to eat. Persephone, hungry after her time in the underworld, ate the seeds without thinking. But this was a trick, or perhaps simply the operation of underworld law. Anyone who ate food in the realm of the dead became bound to that realm and could not leave permanently. Because Persephone had eaten the pomegranate seeds, she could not return completely to the world of the living. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades as his queen, and the rest of the year she could return to the surface to be with her mother. The number of months she had to spend below depended on how many pomegranate seeds she had eaten. some sources saying 3, others 6. This myth explained the seasons. When Persephone returned to the surface each spring, Demeter's joy at her daughter's return caused the earth to bloom and become fertile. Crops grew, flowers blossomed, and life returned to the world. But when Persephone had to descend back to the underworld each fall, Demeter's sorrow caused the earth to become barren. Plants died, leaves fell from trees, and the world entered winter, waiting for Persephone's eventual return to bring spring again. Few mortals ever successfully visited the underworld while still alive, and returned to tell of it. Orpheus, the legendary musician, whose songs could charm animals and even make trees and stones move, descended to the underworld to retrieve his wife, Eurydice, who had died from a snake bite on their wedding day. His music was so beautiful that it softened even Hades' stern heart, and the god of the dead agreed to let Eurydice return to life on one condition. Orpheus must walk out of the underworld ahead of her, and he must not look back to see if she was following until they had both reached the surface. Orpheus agreed and began the long climb back to the world of the living. But just before he reached the surface, doubt overcame him. He looked back to confirm that Eurydice was still there, and in that moment, she was pulled back into the underworld, lost to him forever. Heracles descended to the underworld as part of his 12th labor to capture Cerberus. He wrestled the 3-headed guardian dog into submission and brought it to the surface, showing it to King Eurystheus before returning it to its post. During this descent, Heracles also freed Theseus, who had been trapped there after his failed attempt to help Pirate House abduct Persephone. The underworld represented the Greeks' understanding of death, which was complex and somewhat grim. They did not generally believe in a heavenly paradise waiting for the righteous, nor did they believe in eternal punishment for most sinners. Death was simply the end of life as they knew it, a transition to a shadow existence that was neither terrible nor wonderful for most people, simply different, diminished, a fading of the vitality and intensity that characterized mortal existence. Yet the underworld also offered certain mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries, religious rites celebrated at Eleusis that centered on Demeter, and Persephone promised initiates a better fate in the afterlife. What exactly was revealed during these secret rites was never disclosed, for participants were sworn to silence on pain of death. But those who underwent the mysteries were said to face death with less fear, confident that they would enjoy a blessed existence in the underworld. The exact nature of this blessing remains one of the great secrets of the ancient world, lost when the last initiates died, and the mysteries were no longer celebrated. Legacy and eternal echoes, as we drift into sleep, carried on the currents of these ancient stories. We can reflect on the incredible legacy of Greek mythology. These tales, born thousands of years ago, in a world utterly different from our own, continue to resonate and influence how we understand ourselves, our societies, and our place in the cosmos. The influence of Greek mythology on Western civilization cannot be overstated. It shaped the literature, art, philosophy, and even the science of ancient Greece, which in turn provided the foundation for much of Western culture. The Romans adopted and adapted these myths, giving the gods new names but keeping their essential characters and stories. Through Rome, these myths spread across Europe, and from Europe they traveled to the Americas and beyond. Even today, we use words and phrases derived from Greek mythology constantly, often without realizing it. An Achilles' heel is a vulnerable spot. A narcissist is named for Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection. We speak of titanic struggles and Herculean efforts. We say someone has a Midas touch, or has opened Pandora's box. We describe complicated situations as labyrinthine. These phrases have entered our language so thoroughly that we can use them without knowing their mythological origins. Yet they carry those ancient stories with them into our modern conversations. The themes explored in Greek mythology remain remarkably relevant. The tension between fate and free will, explored in the story of Oedipus, who could not escape the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother despite all his efforts to avoid it. The dangers of hubris, pride that leads mortals to challenge the gods and inevitably brings about their downfall. The complexity of justice and revenge, exemplified in the cycle of violence in the house of Atreus. The power of love and the terrible things people will do for it, shown in countless stories from Helen and Paris to Medea and Jason. Greek mythology gave us archetypes that we still recognize and use today. The hero's journey, identified by scholar Joseph Campbell, follows a pattern established in myths like those of Perseus, Heracles, and Jason. The call to adventure, the tests and trials, the descent into darkness, the return with newfound wisdom or power. The wise mentor, the faithful companion, the temptress, the threshold guardian, all these stock characters in our modern stories have their roots in Greek mythology. The myths also provided early attempts to explain the world through story. Why do we have seasons? Because Persephone must spend part of each year in the underworld. Why do we have suffering and death? Because Pandora opened her jar and released these evils into the world. Why does the sun rise and set? Because Helios drives his chariot across the sky each day. These explanations may not satisfy us scientifically, but they speak to deeper truths about the human experience, about loss and return, about curiosity and consequence, about the eternal cycles of nature. Modern psychology has drawn heavily on Greek mythology for its concepts and terminology. The Oedipus complex, whatever we might think of Freud's theories, takes its name from the mythological king who unknowingly fulfilled the prophecy about killing his father and marrying his mother. The narcissistic personality disorder references Narcissus and his self-destructive self-love. Jung used mythological archetypes to describe patterns in the human psyche that he believed were universal across cultures. The arts continue to draw inspiration from these ancient stories. Countless novels, plays, films, paintings, sculptures, operas, and other works have retold or been inspired by Greek myths. Writers from Shakespeare to James Joyce to Rick Riordan have incorporated these stories into their work. Every time we watch a superhero movie or read a fantasy novel, we are likely engaging with themes, structures, and character types that have their origins in Greek mythology. Perhaps most importantly, Greek mythology reminds us that stories matter. These myths survive not because they were literally true in a historical or scientific sense, but because they were true in a deeper way. They captured something essential about the human experience, about our struggles and our aspirations, our fears and our hopes, our capacity for both greatness and terrible folly. In these stories, We see ourselves reflected, both as we are and as we wish to be. We see the danger of unchecked ambition in Icarus flying too close to the sun. We see the importance of hospitality and respect in the many stories where disguised gods test mortals' virtue. We see the power of perseverance in Odysseus's long journey home. We see the tragedy of good intentions gone wrong in the story of Prometheus. We see beauty and terror, wisdom and folly, comedy and tragedy, all woven together into a rich body of narrative that has proven endlessly renewable and adaptable. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, carried by those ancient tales of gods and heroes, of monsters and mortals, of quests and prophecies fulfilled, rest in the knowledge that you are participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. The stories have been told by countless voices in countless languages, each generation finding in them something valuable, something worth preserving and passing on. The gods and heroes of Greek mythology may never have existed in literal fact, but they exist in our collective imagination, in our language and our literature, in the art that decorates our museums and the philosophy that shapes our thinking. They are part of our cultural DNA, ancient yet eternally fresh, particular to a time and place, but universal in their themes and insights. Sleep well, knowing that these stories will be here tomorrow and the day after, ready to be rediscovered and reinterpreted by new generations, just as they have been for thousands of years. The age of heroes may be over. The gods may no longer speak from Delphi, but the stories endure, and in their endurance, something of that ancient glory lives on. If you enjoyed this journey through the complete story of Greek mythology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the Mythos Deep Dive for more explorations of legendary tales from cultures around the world. Your support helps us continue bringing these timeless stories to life. Rest peacefully, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of ancient realms.